we basically just organized a template of, a bunch of different objective data, like their age, gender, a bunch of different client statistics. That way we could have everything just pour out into a report if we wanted to pull up the amount of people, statistical data from all the files. So, and that was the way we did a lot of the just numbers and a couple other.
You can get access to that finding aid. I'm finishing it. It's almost finished. Any researcher has access, and that made our lives way easier to track cases and make general claims.
We enjoyed the presentation as a group. Particularly, you talked about just falling to grace. It's like falling to grace things like Catherine Newman today with the middle class, this downward mobility that we're seeing. And you were talking about, you saw the same thing during the Great Depression, people that have been upwardly mobile, but now they were going down mobility. And then you said this idea of, and I totally concur with you, that there's a sense of individualism that we have in American society, that we are this strong sense of autonomy, and you sort of pull yourself up out of bootstraps, but we should be totally independent. When in reality, we are very much interdependent. In globalization, we are interdependent. There is no independence, We depend so much on everybody else, and it's that sort of fallacy in thinking that we are totally self-sufficient. And when we try to even move towards how we create these safety nets, like you said, FDR was very much well received when he came up with Social Security. But today, amidst what we just experienced with the economic downturn, they said without what was called a stimulus package, we would be in even worse shape. And people argue, economists, that we should put more money into it. But I find it amazing saying, they want to throw people out of office based on doing what the minimum that they did to address this situation. But yeah, there's a lot of parallels between what happened in the Great Depression and what we're seeing today.
Including a reactionary right-wing group.
Let me add that. Just I ran across this, that some of the early opinion polls at the time, they did. I saw an opinion poll, a very early Gallup poll from 1938. 1938. The payroll tax was already in place, but nobody had received a Social Security check yet. So people were paying into Social Security, getting no benefits from it, and the popular support for Social Security was 90% at that point, and nobody had received a Social Security check yet.
And now we're all getting it. We don't
Right. People take it for granted.
Bruce has been trying to say something first.
I'm glad this came up before me, actually, because I was going to say, although I think I agree with your conclusions about responsibilities and whatnot, I don't think actually the argument's sound. So here's why. Imagine that you have this cooperative garden, and it takes several people to work on it to produce the outcome, the results, the product. And somebody might still say, although we're interdependent, we couldn't get this product without cooperation. Still, the way we ought to distribute the goods is the person who works the hardest and the most should get the most. And that's not an implausible principle of distribution in some context like this. So I don't think it follows from the fact that we're interdependent, that we have responsibilities to others. I think it's true, but I don't think it follows from that fact. The other thing I was going to say, continuing the garden analogy, there might be a better argument for this. That is, suppose you have a garden and several families have cooperated to produce it, and they have children. And the children now are wondering, well, why should we give some of the produce to the elders? After all, they're not working the garden anymore. But on the other hand, if the elders had this kind of implicit or explicit agreement among themselves that that's how things would continue, then I think it would obligate the descendants, even if they said, what's in it for us? Maybe there's not something in it for us, but it doesn't follow they don't have an obligation. Now, there may be a transition way to change things so that they're no longer bound by this obligation, but I think they'd have one, and if they didn't execute the transition right, they would do wrong if they didn't do that.
Yeah, actually, Bruce, you presented the argument in the last chapter, which is my feminist ethics argument. It's that we have responsibility, moral responsibility, ethical responsibility across the generation. So it's not necessarily an exchange or exchange reciprocity. You know, I will do for you because you do for me. It's moral responsibility. I will do for you because someday I will need to have someone do for me, and that person will come forward and help me, because that's the way we work as a community and a society, and I'm responsible for all those before me and all those after me.
But do we still have that as a big question, too?
No, I don't think we do.
Well,
No.
in this country, have we ever? I was just struck by how illustrative your work was of the concept that we learn in our social welfare history, both in part the social welfare history coming from Europe to this country, and how your analyses really illustrate the basic concepts of that history, of how the history of individualism and fostering and advancing the Protestant ethic is continually reinforced. I mean, and the tension always exists in this country. I mean, there have been smaller groups, have there not, that have a different ethic and a different philosophy about how society should be organized, like there were mutual aid societies among different ethnic groups. But it's just interesting to me that as a society we continue to advance the same themes, and that we haven't changed very much.
Well, we continue to have the same argument.
We continue to have the same arguments, and it's almost as if moving to a liberalism and a sort of a left or a collective philosophy is the anomaly, while individualism is the same. That's maybe not perfect, because maybe we do inch towards collectivism, but I'm not sure.
Right. I mean, even the Women's City Club, that was a major, you know, it was middle class, upper middle class. Many ladies, women in Detroit society were part of that group.
Right.
And it's never, I mean, that was an important organizing organization. People who were in Hannon who might be quite destitute would still go to the Women's City Club. We have evidence of this in the files. And yet, do we have similar institutions today that can sustain people even when they lose financially?
We don't. That's why I worry about. That's why I worry about what you said. Your analogy of the garden. I mean, but to take the garden analogy and then generalize it to a societal analogy, I think there's a kind of a fallacy in moving from one side system to another when you're trying to analyze.
A, I don't know why, and B, I have 2 points. One is negative. It doesn't follow from the mere fact of interdependence that you have obligation. And B, although I've rolled off my tongue really easily like the later generations have an obligation, it is really a tricky matter. How can a person have obligations based on implicit or explicit agreements when they weren't around to make them?
Yeah.
I think in anthropology we talk about 3 types of reciprocity operating. One is this generalized where you do things, it's like an act of altruism. You do it on faith, you do it because you feel it's the right thing, you're leading by example, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get something back for it, but it's the right thing to do, the moral code you operate by. Well, I mean, Tom Jakowski was just talking about earlier, the folks that first put in Social Security, they're 90% behind it, even though they're getting not one dime from it yet. That still is good faith. The early generation believed in making sacrifices, whereas this is the generation that believes in making no sacrifice at all. And it's what is in it for me. That's what we call negative reciprocity. I want to get the maximum for whatever and not give a rat's behind about who else is getting cut out of it. Just let me get mine. And that's the problem. And you have balanced reciprocity, which is get tit for tat. I want the same thing back for what I put into it. That's balanced reciprocity. But this generalized reciprocity, to me, that's a very noble thing that we need to work on. How do we continue to cultivate that? And that's how you get this intergenerational thing that goes on, because it's not about, if I take care of my parent, you know, they took